This is the scene I find the most powerful in Henry V. And we remember that Henry V, the king, borrows a cloak and disguises himself, and he goes out among the soldiers. And it appears that he wants to know what's on the soldiers' minds. He has a dialogue with his soldier Williams. Williams doesn't know he's talking to the king. And in the course of this conversation, Williams refers to the responsibility the king has. He says, if the king's cause be not good, then the king has a heavy reckoning to make, right? Whatever got Williams into arms and got him to France, whatever personal decisions he made, ultimately Williams is in France because of what King Henry V did, the decision that King Henry V made to go to war in France. And so ultimately Williams says the responsibility lies with him. And why is it a great responsibility? Because of the toll that combat takes, not only on combatants, but on their family members. All those legs and arms and heads chopped off in battle, Williams says. That horrible scene that follows battles. And these shall join together at the latter day and cry all, we died at such a place. The idea that not only is there a reckoning in this world, there's a reckoning in the next. Some swearing, some crying for a surgeon. We see this a lot in war movies. We read it a lot in war memoirs. Someone gets hit and they cry out for the corpsman or they cry out for the medic. Some calling for their wives left poor behind them. That's a common theme. Some upon their children rawly left. I am afeard there are few die well that die in battle. These words from Williams ring true because I've seen statements like this so many times in combat memoirs. I've heard combat veterans say things like this so much. Let's look at an example. So this war comes just from the Vietnam War veteran Tim O'Brien. He's writing about a fellow soldier who takes a step, and in the process of taking that step, triggers a mine, a trap. Then he took a peculiar half step, moving from shade into bright sunlight, and the booby-trapped 105 round blew him into a tree. The parts were just hanging there, so we remember Williams talks about the arms and the legs and the head right on the battlefield. The parts were just hanging there, so Dave Jensen and I were ordered to shinny up and peel him off. I remember the white bone of the arm. I remember the pieces of skin and something wet and yellow that must have been the intestines. The gore was horrible and stays with me. There's this idea not only of the horribleness of the scene itself in that world of war, but the ongoing horribleness in the memory of the combatant. Williams gets at that. I think Shakespeare is just so right on with this passage that he puts into Williams' mouth. Not only the toll of battle itself, but the toll of the battle on family members and the ongoing toll of battle in memory. Another passage from Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. He said he was scared. This is a medic. And it wasn't normal scared. He didn't know what it was. Too long in country, that is, too long in Vietnam, probably. Or else he wasn't cut out to be a medic. Always policing up the parts, he said. Well, that reminds me of Williams, right? You want something to bury. And in some cases, there's not much to bury. You want to get what you can. Always plugging up holes, battle holes, shrapnel holes. Sometimes he'd stare at guys who were still okay, the alive guys. He'd stare at them and start to picture how they'd look dead. The psychological toll of battle that Williams touches on a bit. Without arms or legs, that sort of thing. It was ghoulish, he knew that, but he couldn't shut off the pictures. These quotes come to us from a book that reflects on the Vietnam War. We find something that's written in a different style that comes to us from the American Civil War, and yet there's a similarity here. And again, this passage reminds me of Williams' words in Henry V. So Samuel Watkins is a Confederate soldier, and this is what he writes in his memoir. We passed on, and coming to a pile of our slain, we had turned over several of our dead, when one of the ladies screamed out, "There he is! Poor fellow, dead, dead, dead." She ran to the pile of slain and raised the dead man's head and placed it on her lap and began kissing him and saying, "Oh, they have killed my darling, my darling, my darling." That reminds us of William's words. In this case, in William's case, he's talking of the soldier crying out for his wife, but of course the wives will cry out for their soldiers as well. "Oh, mother, what must I do? My poor, poor darling. Oh, they've killed him. They have killed him." I could witness the scene no longer, Watkins says. I turned and walked away, and William A. Hughes, one of his fellow soldiers, was crying and remarked, "Oh, this war is a terrible thing." So the style is different, but you see the common sense of things. Combat veterans will often talk about what they see on the battlefield. They often won't go into details. And these are just photos that I recently came across. These are photos of dead enemy from the Vietnam War. And in this case, we don't have, it's terrible to say it, but in this case, we don't have dismemberment such as Williams speaks of, such as Tim O'Brien writes of, such as Sam Watkins knew of. But still the horrible scenes of these defeated enemy. But then there are photos of dead American soldiers. The photo at the top comes from D-Day, June 1944, this invasion of the Second World War. The photo below does as well. And so we see photos like this, and then we read passages like what Williams says in Henry V, like what O'Brien writes in The Things They Carried, like what Sam Watkins writes in his memoir, Company H. And we conclude, yeah, war is terrible, as Williams suggests. Yeah, war is terrible. And yet, there's something else. We see these photos, these casualties, these killed in action from the invasion of France in the Second World War, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Then at the same time, we might look at this photo of these soldiers moving onto the beach on D-Day and feel inspired by them. Combat veterans will often speak as Williams spoke. But then there's something else as well, that a combat veteran a couple weeks ago said something I've heard many times before, reflecting back on the war in Vietnam. And he said, you know, that war in Vietnam was a terrible thing. It was a horrible experience. And yet there's something about it that I miss. There's something about it that I've missed ever since these 50 years. And so it's an interesting theme. And there's a lot of the themes that come to my mind when I reflect on passages in Henry V. It's fundamentally a psychological theme. You can read Williams, you can read Tim O'Brien, you can read Sam Watkins, you can read other memoirs, you can talk to combat veterans, and you can know that there's something horrible about war, but then you look at photos like this and you can feel inspired by it. Still, there's something that attracts you to it, perhaps. And I can bring this home to myself because I watched this film recently with my son. It's a son related to the conflict in Afghanistan. And the basic story is you have 4 Navy SEALs and 3 of them don't survive. And you would think, you know, coming out of this movie, that a parent would think, wow, well, I would not want my son to do that. I would not want my son to be in a position where he could find himself in a mountain in Afghanistan with a very small chance of survival. You would think coming out of a movie like this, that would be the response. And yet, knowing everything I know after more than 20 years of interviewing combat veterans, even after watching this movie where 3 of 4 Americans don't survive, not to mention the many Afghan fighters, Taliban fighters who don't survive. Despite all that, when the movie was over, I found myself thinking it would be okay with me if my own son went into the military and went into special forces and potentially found himself in a situation like this. And that's curious because given everything I know, I tell myself, well, that's crazy. Why? I mean, you know that war is terrible. Listen to Williams. Listen to Tim O'Brien. Listen to Sam Watkins. Listen to the hundreds of combat veterans you've talked to. Listen to the many other veterans whose memoirs you've written. And yet, there's still that draw. There's still that attraction. Of course, not everyone feels that attraction, but there's still that attraction that makes me think, yeah, that would be okay if even someone I love wanted to enter that world. It's a strange and mysterious thing. I'm just describing it as it is. I guess I'll have to leave understanding it to people with greater psychological understanding than I have. But to get back to where we began, this passage in Shakespeare, it shows us that Shakespeare did some degree of homework. Perhaps he talked to combatants. He used his moral imagination to think about what it would be like to come out of war. War is a horrible thing. War is a horrible thing. Combat is a terrible thing. And yet we have to acknowledge that at least for some, even for those who've been through it, who can say how horrible it is, even for them, they will also say, but there's something that's nevertheless attractive about it. And that is a really interesting phenomenon.